Good morning, everyone. I'm Phoenix Rising, the presenter of today's topic, neurodiversity and the nervous system. I originally presented this on December 8th for Cedar Springs Hospital in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I got a lot of requests for people wanting to view it after the presentation was over, and they did not record it. So I thought I'd send a little recording out for all of you who wanted to check out this presentation and didn't get the opportunity. Here's today's agenda. Give you all a minute to look it over. We're going to be covering a lot of topics today. I'd really encourage you to listen to the words that I'm saying as opposed to the words written on the slides. The slides are really secondary, and there's a lot of information on some of them for you to review later. That's kind of the intention. So just a heads up on that. All right, so let's get started. I wanted to give a brief introduction of who I am and why I'm speaking about this topic today. A little bit about my personal background. In childhood, like so many of us, I went through a lot of different kinds of trauma, and that left me in a really sore spot in my teenage years and 20s. Had to deal with complex PTSD. A lot of times that looked like borderline personality disorder symptoms, and a whole host of other not so fun things to have to deal with. And I had been in and out of therapy since I was 6. So clearly the people around me saw that something was wrong, but no one could really figure out what it was. Instead of recognizing that I was ADHD and autistic and a highly sensitive person, people thought that I was just kind of a bad kid, that I, wasn't able to follow all of the rules and all that. So kind of made a bad reputation for myself. I really pulled myself up through my 20s though, and I really felt very driven to succeed and to help other people who were struggling in the ways that I was struggling. Because I was like, nobody is helping me. I'm not getting the things that I need. I'm trying to function in this world and it's not working on so many levels, and I didn't understand what was going on. And unfortunately, none of the therapists I saw could figure it out either. So it really wasn't a good situation. I worked hard in school eventually and went to NYU for my graduate programs in social work. And I spent 6 years in New York City working primarily with trauma survivors, anywhere from 12 to 24. I did a lot of different things, program, policy, clinical. It was a lot of, it was such a great time in my life to know what these different systems are actually doing to the clients involved, like the criminal justice system, the education system, child welfare, things like that. I really got that firsthand, working with those client populations in New York. But I was really frustrated with a lot of the traditional models that were out there for therapy. I felt like, it was re-traumatizing some of the clients who were experiencing this type of therapy, just like I kind of felt re-traumatized when I entered therapy. So that was not so good. So part of me just kept feeling like there's something missing. There's something here that I can't figure out. So fast forward down the road, I'm left New York and Denver, started a private practice, tried to work towards my clinical hours again, and I learned about more nervous system somatic-based therapy models. And I took this amazing 30-hour somatic training in Denver that just really shifted everything I thought I knew about trauma and what was happening, and really helped me to reframe the healing that I had been doing on myself, the healing I'd been doing with my clients, in a way that made more sense, because it didn't fit in traditional models. And like I said, it's like something's missing. So learning all of that about the nervous system really revolutionized my work, and I wanted to get this information out there to people. There's so much that I had already been doing that I wanted to share. So I created the Art of Self-Healing Center in 2019 with a nervous system based model, doing coaching and classes and seeing like, is this something that I could develop more? So it turns out it was. I got a lot of really good feedback about the program and what I was teaching, but something was still missing. Something was still not aligned. So it was not flying for the people I was targeting to. You know, I tried to aim at a different populations, and it didn't really work for any of them. So I kind of threw my hat in the ring and said, okay, I really want to get back to clinical work. So I started the Therapy for Rebels in 2021 with the idea that I'm offering therapy to people who are different. And I couldn't really figure out how they were different. I was just like, people who are different than the normal people. And I didn't have the language, right? But quickly I found out that there's this beautiful concept called neurodiversity, and that's really what I wanted to do. What I wanted to focus on is people who were different in that way. So I was learning more about it. I was working with more neurodivergent populations. I opened my doors to autistics and ADHDers. And something happened when when I did that, because I realized through my work with them, oh, this is actually a big reflection of who I am. And I started thinking about it. You know, so many of my friends throughout the years were either ADHD or autistic. And I hadn't really put the pieces together until I started working with these populations earlier this year. And it was like such a mind-blowing situation for me. So it's really helped me to just reframe everything that I've been through and help me to actually communicate that into the world. It helped me to better understand why I was so different, why I was having trouble functioning, like why there are these missing pieces in communication and socializing that just like weren't syncing for me. And it was just very confusing and honestly like very maddening. So I spent this year serving over 100 teens, somewhere between 10 and 19 years old, with this nervous system based model. And it has gone so successfully that now I'm opening up more avenues to teaching what I've learned in a variety of ways, which I'll get into it towards the end. So I'm so excited to talk to you guys today about all the things that I've been learning and discovering, and you know, it's like over a decade, maybe a lifetime's worth of experience and information going into this presentation today. So I'm really excited that you all are here for me. This journey has, I mean, this has been my life. So thank you all for coming and being willing to talk about these topics. So what is neurodiversity? Well, humans have a wide variety of brain structures that occur naturally based on our evolution. So we've got some categories here, and this is not all inclusive. We've got any mental illness, could be considered someone who's neurodivergent. Complex PTSD, definitely a big structure change in the brain when someone goes through that as a child. Then we've got sensory neurodivergence. So those are people with different sensory differences, such as autistics, ADHD, and highly sensitive people. There's some other categories too that are less well known. And what we're finding is that these sensory neurodivergent people are not broken or disordered, but actually have evolved through nature to serve a particular place in our tribe. And there's lots of other forms of neurodivergence. Really, anyone who feels markedly different could be neurodivergent. Creative types, gifted and talented. Psychedelic users can change the way that their brain is wired through their psychedelic use. And the LGBTQ plus community. And there's many more. So these are the three common forms of sensory neurodivergence, and I would argue the most well known. So highly sensitive people. It's actually 15 to 20% of the population, and it's the majority of your therapy clients that are coming in the door. ADHDers. Some states range for youth between 6 and 16%. That's also very high. And I think there's also a high prevalence of underreported cases, just like there is with autistics, due to certain biases in the way that the DSM is written and the way that we think about these different disorders. There's actually a lot of gifted people, and a lot of people are flying under the radar, like myself. Um, so that's something to keep in mind as we're looking at these numbers. And then autistics, 2.2% of the population diagnosed. Again, I think there's a huge prevalence of underreported cases, and they're even talking about autism being a profile underneath highly sensitive people. And that's same for ADHDers as well. If you look at the common traits for HSPs, it's the same for the other two groups as well. So when you add them all up, we're talking over 20% of the population. And granted, there's some overlap here, but that's 1 in 5. And again, it's the majority of therapy clients. So these are the 5 common traits of sensory neurodivergence. And this is a list that I personally put together based on my experience and education and all that. So the first one is depth of processing. So sensory neurodivergent people, or sensory NDs, think very deeply and complexly about what they perceive and experience. Autistic people supposedly perceive and process 43% more information than your average neurotypical person. So there's a lot more going on in the brain. There's also sensory differences. So sensory information can feel a lot more intense or more muted depending on a lot of factors. And neurotypical people don't really have to deal with that. They're kind of desensitized in a way, and when we compare the two groups. There's also a lot of communication differences in body language, word choice, tone, and content. And that's true for all 3 of the groups, although I would argue that autistic people have the most communication differences and HSPs have the least, if that makes sense. HSPs tend to communicate more like neurotypicals, but they also have neurodivergent communication patterns as well. I'll dive into all that later on. Increased empathy. So there's actually increased mirror neurons in the brain, which cause a heightened level of empathy. Now, this may be surprising to some of you, especially because there's a stereotype out there that autistic people are not empathetic. And I would actually argue that that's kind of misunderstood. There's a few things going on there, partly because of all these differences in the brain. Neurotypical people and autistic people just don't really understand each other that well, right? And when any groups are kind of opposing like that, you're going to have this sort of decrease of empathy, right? Like Republicans versus Democrats. It's a good example. So that could be part of it. Another factor is that a lot of autistic people actually say that they have an over drive for empathy, and that it becomes overwhelming and they shut it down. So then they kind of seem cold and like not very, empathetic. But that's actually it's just a shutdown effect of their nervous system, and it's heightened so much. So again, we have these different understandings of what these things are and what they look like, and they're not always true. Emotional reactivity. So we have deep, intense emotions that can come on suddenly, and it also makes us prone to dysregulation. So imagine all of your emotions just being turned way up. That's what it feels like for many of us, and it can cause some shutdown, which I'll talk about later as well. So those are the 5 common traits in a nutshell. So this really gives us a new definition for ADHD and autism. All right, these disorders we can now see as neurotypes. People who have very sensory sensitive nervous systems that are prone to chronic stress and trauma. And when that happens, especially when we're young, executive functioning doesn't develop properly under those conditions. So it's really difficult to separate what is the traits of this neurotype versus developmental issues versus chronic stress and trauma. It all kind of gets mixed up. And I think it's a good example of why someone like me wasn't diagnosed and wasn't recognized. My traits are not so severe that they were being flagged. Neurotypicals, I mentioned this earlier, tend to dislike neurodivergent people, particularly autistics, and that can cause a lot of prejudice, social isolation, and more trauma. So, really not ideal. I wanted to talk for a couple minutes about the overlap and diagnosis for neurodivergence. I think this is really important, especially from a clinical standpoint for you therapists in the audience. I'm sure that many of the therapists I personally saw diagnosed me with something like social anxiety as opposed to autism, or PTSD as opposed to ADHD. And while I was struggling with PTSD, granted, you can see how my personal neurotypes or diagnosis would have been missed. So I encourage you all to familiarize yourself with these different um, differences between the diagnoses. I'd love to go through all of this, but I do not have time today, unfortunately. So just know that this exists and that it's a very real problem for us mental health professionals as we're evaluating our clients and trying to get them the support that they need. Because it's going to make a huge difference, just like it did for me. Like, I just felt like therapy was useless because my actual problem was not being addressed. Why autism isn't a spectrum. So there's a lot of people coming forward saying that the DSM is based on neurotypical functioning and can be seen as ableist, right? So when we're asking people to function in our society, that is very different from how we evolved as far as work, school, relationships, community, all of that is very different. And it's causing a lot of stress and trauma on the neurodivergent folks who do not fit into that world. We fit into more of a hunter-gatherer type society, and so these structures and these demands are just too much, right? And so we can't function in this society. But if we were in hunter-gatherer times or in more supportive environments, we wouldn't have these problems to the extent that we do, right? Especially when we're talking about executive functioning issues. So preferred terminology for a lot of people in the autistic community, instead of having these different levels of functioning, uh, preferred terminology is high needs versus low needs, verbal versus nonverbal, and removing of the disordered labels. An autistic person versus a person with autism. Right, you see the difference there. But people will ask, well, what about severe autism? Isn't this a thing? Like, no one can be having a good time having severe autism, right? And really, what's going on there is some people have more extreme traits, just like you can see for any kind of trait. Let's say how extroverted you are versus introverted, right? It's all on a spectrum. Everything's on a spectrum. We kind of take it for granted, but everything's on a spectrum. There's a spectrum of depression and anxiety, but we don't frame it like that, right? So recognizing that some of these traits it's fine if they're on the more extreme end. Now, where are the problems? A lot of people with severe autism actually have comorbid problems, and they get highlighted in the media and unfortunately a lot of nonprofits and things like that who use autistic people as sort of the ultimate victim who needs help. Some of these comorbid problems can be developmental delays, severe trauma, and other illnesses like seizure disorders. And that's where people are getting really confused about, like, what does this severe autism actually look like? Right? Because I know I've had lots of clients at this point who are severely autistic, right? Their traits are on the higher end of the spectrum, but their functioning is actually okay, and their coping is decent, and they're getting through college, right? So I really think that the media plays a role in what we think of as autism, and it's not really helping the community at all. Now, it's important to note not everyone in the autistic community feels like this. Some people are like, autism's definitely a disorder. I need to be cured. Help me. Right? So this is just a more recent shift that we're seeing among many people in the community, is moving away from autism being a disorder and moving towards autistic people as being seen as their own neurotype and have, you know, their challenges and also their gifts, just like everyone. So I want to take a look at the nervous system chart. I could spend 2 hours talking about this chart easily, but I'm just going to make some key points over about the next 5 or 10 minutes that I think are important for you to understand in my work with neurodivergent people. Because as I've been saying, we're more sensory sensitive in so many ways, or sometimes muted. So how does that end up impacting our nervous system? Our nervous system is just way more sensitive than your average person. So I'll get into that in some of the other slides, but right now we're just going to focus on some of the pieces that are true for every human. A little bit about the evolution of the human brain. The fight, flight, freeze system that you're looking at on the left was really developed a long time ago, thousands and thousands of years. And this is the same system that dinosaurs were using, that lots of other animals around the planet rely on this very foundational survival system. Fast forward through evolution, we develop other parts of our brain, such as our prefrontal cortex behind our forehead. The fight, flight, freeze system is back here by the brainstem. And what's happening with those two pieces together is that when we start to move towards that fight, flight, freeze system, our ability to access our prefrontal cortex, which is where executive functioning lies, becomes less and less accessible, especially when we're getting into those freeze states. And a good way to look at it is we no longer have control over our responses. Our body is taking over for the sake of our survival, and we don't have a choice in that. The example I like to use is, let's say you're walking through the woods on a path and you see a snake and you scream and you jump back to protect yourself. And then you take a second look and you realize it's a stick in the grass. In that moment, did you choose to scream and jump back to protect yourself? No, it just happened. So those are the kinds of survival responses we're talking about, especially when it comes to neurodivergent people of the populations we've been mentioning. There's not a lot of control that we have when we're getting into certain states. And that's really critical for people to understand, because it's not fair for certain demands to be made of us when we physically can't. As you're looking at this chart, you see it's ranked from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have to move through these sequentially. That's how evolution designed us. So when we're hitting this state 2 stress response, our body's actually getting overwhelmed with stress. And if there's no solution and the threat doesn't disappear, we're going to move into those freeze symptoms automatically. So I hinted at this a few times already, but sensory neurodivergent people can get really overwhelmed by certain things. Could be sensory, could be empathy, could be stress. And we often get pushed into those freeze responses, which looks like you're shut down and you're collapse. And it really is important to recognize, like, these are trauma responses. People kind of want to sugarcoat it and say, oh, well, our nervous system's just dysregulated. Oh, well, we're just in this different state. But it's like, yeah, but that state was evolved out of trauma, right? So it's not something that we should be regularly experiencing. Everyone should really be in a state zero the majority of the time. And that, unfortunately, is just not so many of our realities, especially these days in our society, for anyone. So once you go up the states, let's say you get to state 4, our body also has to down regulate. So we can't just skip from state 4 to state 0. We have to go from a 4 to a 3 to a 2 to a 1 back to a 0. That's the down regulation process of the nervous system. So when we start to say, how can we achieve that? How do we help people to regulate their nervous system? It's really beautiful. All of those qualities in state 0 are ways that we can guide our coping skills and help our body down regulate. So everyone has their own unique nervous system pattern, meaning that in these different states, we're going to be more familiar, or it's going to be more accessible to feel certain things. Like example, some people are more anxious, other people are more angry, right? So figuring out our unique pattern is key here. A lot of clients come in and they're like, I don't have any coping skills. I can't relax. I'm in fight or flight all the time. And we start to really break down this chart. And it's like, are you really? Because I bet you're have times where you're able to eat a meal and feel okay. Maybe times when you feel connected to somebody, even if it's just a character on a TV show. I'm sure there's times where you feel more compassionate or grateful. So really breaking down these different qualities and helping people to understand that they have coping skills already, and it's just about nurturing those and helping those develop, so we can have more and more state 0 skills, so to speak. And then when we're, dysregulated or need to, take a break and calm ourselves down, we know what to do because we already have some of those skills and plans in place. So experiencing any of these states is not going to traumatize you, right? So I want to talk for a minute about the differences between experiencing trauma symptoms and a freeze response like you're seeing on the chart versus PTSD or complex PTSD. So the latter happens when stress and trauma go unresolved with no solution to the threat. And what that basically means is that we're now sort of stuck in this nervous system state. Let's say we're constantly hypervigilant and on guard. We're, always planning for the exit door, so to speak. And that's just not a good place to be in, right? And that's really coming from past experience of feeling like I'm not safe where I am, especially in schools. I have a lot of clients who just do not feel safe in school for a variety of reasons. And so it's important to help them find ways that they can feel safe and regulated, even just if it's a little bit more than they're experiencing now, right? You don't have to be 100% at state 0, but it's just about helping the body regulate a little bit more, trying to get back to that state 0, learning those skills, and over time we're able to widen our window of tolerance for what we can handle and manage, right? So then we're more able to be in that state 0 regularly and able to know how to cope when we're in the other states. The last thing I want to mention is all of these states are also on their own spectrum. So sometimes people can be, kind of slightly in a freeze place. Excuse me. Or having really mild anxiety. It doesn't always have to look like big, bad, intense trauma and like shock reactions. It can be very mild as we're experiencing these different states. It just really depends on the person, the situation. But the idea is if we have a lot of activation in our nervous system, how do we slowly turn that down so we're not as impacted by it? and that's really about regulating the nervous system and taking care of ourselves every time we're upset, basically. So what are some nervous system challenges for our sensory NDs? We've got an interest-based nervous system. So our nervous system is actually wired differently than your neurotypical person. And in our society, that causes a lot of challenges and causes a lot of stress and ends up impacting our nervous system quite a bit. There's also these communication differences. Again, anytime that we're not feeling safe, our nervous system is going to be activated in that fight, flight, freeze response. So those communication differences, even though you might think they're not related to the nervous system, oh, they definitely are. Anytime we don't feel seen and understood and valued, we're going to feel under threat. Another big problem is burnout and sensory trauma. Because things are so intense for us and we have to navigate all these additional challenges that other people don't seem to be faced by, we get really burnt out and we end up with sensory trauma. So that's when it's not a trauma in the way of an event trauma that's happened. It's more that we're sensory overwhelmed. There's too much going on. There's too much for us to manage. There's too much stress. And so we go into that shutdown, freeze, collapse response you saw in the nervous system's chart. And all these issues with chronic stress and chronic trauma that so many of us live through causes so much of the executive dysfunction that we're experiencing. I think that we'd have some quirks to our brain in the way that it functions for sure, regardless of stress. But the stress is adding to the problem so severely that that's where you're seeing people get caught in the diagnosis categories, right? Those are the people who are struggling the most and have the most outward challenges, are the people who are getting tagged with these diagnoses. Oh, I skipped way too far. Hold on. Okay. So let's look at your interest-based nervous system. Unlike neurotypical who have a priority focused nervous system, us at sensory NDs have a interest-based nervous system. So our focus goes towards what's most interesting. And that's really true for ADHDers and Autistics. I haven't, there's not the same amount of there's not the same information as there are for highly sensitive people and vice versa, because really talked about differently. Like one's talked about as a disorder, the other one's talked about as a just general neurotype. So I'm not sure where HSPs land in this, but it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of them are more interest-based, but I also know that some of them are definitely priority. So everybody's different, right? So our focus is really going to go towards what's interesting. I'll give an example. So many of my clients struggle with this, where they wake up on a Saturday and they have some homework to do, or they have a friend that they're excited to see, or something else is going on that's taking their focus, their interest, and they get up and they start working on those things and they forget to eat breakfast. And then they're kind of spinning out around lunchtime, wondering like, why am I so anxious and all over the place and unfocused? It's because you skipped breakfast. Right? Whereas a person who has a priority focused nervous system would wake up and be like, it's time for breakfast, right? We're not going to get they're not going to get distracted with those other interests. Challenge and competition is also really important. So anything that helps us to feel challenged, or like that healthy sense of competitiveness, can help drive our motivation. Then we got novelty and routine. Now this model was originally created for ADHDers, and then a lot of autistic people were like, hey, this is me too. So for novelty, that's more your ADHDers. For routine, that's more your autistic folks. So new experiences and or routine are really necessary. Boredom or too many changes can be painful and or traumatizing. All depends on what the needs of that individual are. And then a sense of urgency. And again, this is especially true for ADHDers, can help us to focus. So if there's a deadline, we're more likely to get it done. This presentation is a really great example of this for me because I have been wanting to put something like this together. You know, so much of the information I'm presenting today, I have taught in other forms, and I'm like, I don't really have time to do this. And when the opportunity came to speak for Cedar Springs Hospital, I jumped on that and I set myself a deadline, right? And so I created that sense of urgency for myself. I'm like, I want to get this presentation done and out there and available for people by the end of the year, right? So I set myself a manageable timeline and got it done. And, you know, so I think that learning to hijack our system, so to speak, is really critical because we're not like neurotypical people. We do not function that way, and we're not motivated by the same things. Neurotypicals are also motivated by reward and punishment, which doesn't fly for a lot of ADHDers, and can be really harmful for autistic people. Communication differences. So different sensory ND groups have their own communication styles. So we've got shared interests and experiences. A lot of us have a deep need for like quality communication, we'll say. Our conversations tend to be focused on interests, values, and ideas, and we want to reflect shared experiences. So that means when one person shares a story about themselves or their experience, we want to share something similar that happened to us as a way to reflect understanding. Neurotypical people find this weird and kind of narcissistic, and we're just trying to connect. HSPs don't like small talk. It's definitely one of their things as well. Like I said, HSPs have more neurotypical communication styles than some of the other groups like Autistics, but there is quite a mix that I've noticed in my clients. And, you know, more research needs to be done. So there's differences in body language. I'm not going to spell all of these out for you, but all of these differences in communication and in speech patterns, right? They're going to make it difficult for us to talk to our neurotypical peers. It's just not a match in so many ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with the double empathy problem later on. But basically know that like when I learned some of this, I was like, wow, this is like the missing pieces of so many of my communication. And it's not even on here because I overlook it as so obvious, but there's also people who communicate in very direct ways and people who communicate in very indirect ways. And so I was, you know, I personally was having a very difficult time with people who are indirect passive communicators. I just didn't understand what was happening and like what they were trying to say and what it all meant. Right. But there's lots of neurotypicals who have no problem reading what's going on. So being able to understand some of these differences and being able to own, especially, you know, I just want to encourage all of my clients that not everybody is your people, right? So find the people who you have that shared language with, who it feels like you can just communicate your authentic truth very easily. There's not this like added anxiety and shame around communication. Certain people are just going to be easier to talk to than others. And when I explain this to my clients, so many of them are just like floored. They're like, wow, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just talking to the wrong people. It's like, yeah, it's like you're from different countries and you have different values and you're just not going to be able to connect even if you're speaking the same language, right? So helping people to understand that and move towards the people who do understand them, who they can communicate with, because so many of my clients are able to kind of reverse a lot of trauma just by being able to redirect who they interact with and how. It's amazing. All right, the double empathy problem. So communication really breaks down, especially between autistic and non-autistic people, and it's really a two-way issue. So both parties are not understanding each other and are often judging each other and just um, not not being very kind. So you can really think of these different groups as having like bordering countries, right? And each has its own language and culture. So you've got like neurotypical people, highly sensitive people, ADHD people, and autistic people. And that's like a really loose representation conceptually. But the idea is that your neurotypical people and your autistic people are on like two sides of a different island, right? And there's all this stuff in between, so they really don't get a lot of opportunity to socialize with each other and get to understand and build a bridge, whereas people who are on the bordering countries like neurotypicals and HSPs, there's more of a bridge for understanding. So you can kind of frame it like that. There's a really big problem, unfortunately, though, because autistic people are seen as so different than your neurotypical peers. There's a lot of masking and mutism that ends up happening with a lot of autistic people. So that basically looks like, I'll describe it for my own personal example. For a very long time, people thought I was just very quiet and kind of nice. And I'm not really sure that they thought much more about me past that. That's how I kind of learned to survive, is I'm just going to keep quiet. I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm going to try to be as, invisible as I possibly can, to make it through like this weird place that I don't understand what's going on, where I feel like I'm an alien and like nobody understands me at all. Not nobody, but most people. And it really did cause a kind of mutism where, I'd be standing with a group of peers, trying to socialize, and I just didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. And I just like would sit there and just didn't do anything. Right? It's like, when is it my turn to speak? What do I say? All of that was very confusing, and I didn't have a roadmap like neurotypicals do. And so that, caused a lot of harm. It caused a lot of trauma to me over the years of not feeling like I could express myself and be myself. And I feel really wild and weird, and I fit into all these other categories that people don't understand. And it's not been fun. But, having the framework of being autistic and ADHD has really helped me to own who I am and what I'm about, and I don't apologize for myself anymore. And the idea of masking like rarely even comes up in my everyday life, because I feel so comfortable with the people that I'm around, and I've really created a life that works for me, where other people speak my language, and so I don't have to deal with as much of that kind of trauma socially that I was having to navigate previous. So that's just an example of how that issue can come up, and it's really tough. It's really, really tough. So let's look at sensory burnout and trauma. I mean, burnout and sensory trauma. So that's really being stuck in freeze. So I mentioned before, there's just so many differences between now and tribal times as far as caregiving, school, work, technology. There's all of these additional stressors on sensory NDs that people just take for granted every day. And so we get this message that like we're being too much, and we don't really like we're just being drama queens, basically. Like that's what I was called. It's like, you're just being a drama queen. It's like, no, I'm not okay right now. This is not okay. So again, that's just adding to the trauma. We're not being recognized and validated. Executive dysfunction always occurs when we're in a place of burnout or sensory trauma, right? We don't have the same access to that prefrontal cortex when we're stuck in freeze. So it's just very difficult for us to function even more than we were before. Meltdowns and shutdowns are really typical for autistic people. So it happens a lot of times when we're just overloaded. Could be chronic stress, could be too much sensory information back to back. And it causes us to kind of freak out. And if you recall the nervous systems chart, we kind of shift between state 2 and 3, going back and forth as the nervous system is trying to regulate. and then it will finally like shut down when it's just too much. So that's really unfortunate. For ADHDers, the pattern for the nervous system response tends to be overdrive and then collapse. So we're in that state one where have that increased energy and excitement, right? Those are state one qualities. And we're like, yeah, I'm gonna go do all the things. Let's do it. And we're doing this, we're doing that, we're getting distracted, we're trying to finish this project, get distracted with another project. Maybe people are playing lots of video games, whatever. We go into this overdrive place and then we collapse once it's overwhelmed our nervous system. And then we're depressed for a couple days and don't want to get out of bed. And I think this is why depression so oftentimes goes along with ADHD, is because it's really sensory trauma and getting stuck in that freeze and burnout. Burnout for autistic people long term looks very different than just having a shutdown or collapse. It's really more of a chronic problem that, I mean, you can just imagine being stuck in those freeze symptoms for a long time. Whereas these meltdowns, shutdowns, overdrive, collapse, you might see that pattern happen within a couple days and then move back towards regulation. Whereas a full burnout is like you are really stuck in freeze for a long period of time. And that can also look like major depression and complex PTSD. We're all way more at risk for that, unfortunately. And again, those are very much freeze responses. Complex PTSD is kind of like a mix of all of that nervous system activation all at once being really intense. Right, so executive dysfunction. This is so many of the common issues that are talked about for ADHDers and autistics. And executive functioning in a nutshell is the ability to plan, prioritize, and organize. We can solve complex problems. We have self-awareness and self-reflection, the ability to think before acting and not being impulsive. Right, and so some common issues when our executive dysfunction is really kicking in: poor time management, poor working memory, emotional dysregulation, impulsivity, slow processing, meltdowns, shutdowns, autistic mutism, all that, right? All of that is really tied to our prefrontal cortex and our executive functioning that is being disrupted so much because of the chronic stress and trauma so many of us are living through, right? And now some of these issues like working memory, ADHDers are just not going to have a great working memory, I think, despite the chronic stress or not. But the more chronic stress there is, the worse our working memory is, if that makes sense. So this is why we're disordered, right? Is we're really living in a society that's asking too much from us, and we're shutting down. You know, our communication's different. We're being ostracized and judged and misunderstood so often. And it's really just making it very, very difficult for us to live and function, which is why we're disabled and disordered. So let's look at intervention strategies. So here the goal is really reducing that executive dysfunction, increasing self-awareness and acceptance, and increasing our social connections. So we're going to look at these 5 topics today. So holistic lifestyle strategies. Live like your ancestors in hunter-gatherer times is really the shortcut here, right? And I think so many of these things people know are good for us, right? Like, yeah, sure, having a healthy diet with meat and fruit and vegetables and cutting out grains and dairy and things like that. Any inflammatory foods, that's probably a good thing. But so many of us don't do it. And for sensory neurodivergent people, all of these things become so much more critical because of our sensitive bodies and nervous systems. We really can't tolerate not having these things in our life. And again, it's just adding to the executive dysfunctioning that people are completely overlooking. It's like, whoa, like, example, autistics are gluten sensitive typically, and ADHDers tend to lack protein, right? And just those 2 fixes can be such a huge game changer and people just totally overlook it typically and just go towards medication, which is not the answer, I think. Increased exercise, right? It helps to balance our dopamine, our cortisol, and increases serotonin and dopamine, right? It can help reduce all of these hyperactive fight flight responses. So there's just like really basic things we could be doing. Sleeping, right? Having good sleep hygiene, even watching the sunrise increases melatonin production, things that we would have been doing in hunter-gatherer times. But now that we're indoors, we don't get access to a lot of these things. And then really focusing on sensory needs. So how do we balance our need for stimulation and downtime? I think is really important. Using sensory-based coping skills and reducing that chronic stress will really help with sensory issues. I know for myself and so many of my clients, the more stress there is, the more our sensory system's going to get kind of screwed up. Especially for autistic people, it's just like that dial is being turned up so much, and it's like, oh my God, this one small light in my room is making me feel sick because it's just too much stimulation. Really thinking about how technology impacts that as well. So I've been making a nervous systems coping skills plan with my clients. Again, many of them are teens, and this has been working really well for them. So, we outline what coping skills they are already doing in the different nervous system states to help themselves calm down or regulate. Then we address areas of weakness or need. And that's kind of where I come in with my expertise. It's like, you could tweak this or that, and I think that would really help your situation overall. And it's all about teaching those new skills. So depending on the suggestions I'm making, it could be mindfulness, somatic, breathing, movement, lifestyle. Any of those changes are teaching new skills. And then the use of habit change tools, such as the stages of change, which I just love for motivational interviewing. So helping people to actually put the skills in place. And I think there's like this gap where we teach someone something, but then we don't actually teach them how to change their habits in the moment. When we're talking about ingrained nervous system responses that are happening unconsciously, right? It's not like we can just put these skills into action overnight. Like we really do need the stages of change model or something like that in its place. And then here's an example of the chart in action. So there's a couple different coping skills for each section. And again, it just really depends on the person. Some people might be more body oriented. Some people might be more mind oriented, where they're trying to change their thoughts, like CBT. Some people might be more sensory oriented, like just helping our clients to discover kind of what they're already doing, and how we can harness that and just teach a couple new skills instead of overwhelming people with like learning a bunch of new stuff. And this is really why I call my project the art of self-healing, is because I believe that the nervous system is attempting to self-heal and regulate all the time. So we actually do have some of these skills kind of built in because it's just evolution, it's nature. I really do think that everyone heals over a long period of time, whether they're trying to or not, because the body is trying to move towards that regulation. We're either living and healing or we're slowly dying, which does happen as well. And this box on the end, how others can help, I think is critical as well. Oops. So psychoeducation, having a strengths-based perspective. I love sharing about the neurodivergent traits instead of the DSM deficits with my clients, really helping them to better understand they're just a really different person with a different brain, and that's okay. That's actually a beautiful thing. There's differences in our communication style. It's not that we're communicating poorly. It's just that we need to find people who are the right matches for us. Learning more about that interest-based nervous system is such a game changer for my clients. They can really see like, oh, I can see why I'm not motivated in this particular area. Like I have a new client who I just started with, and they are really not doing well at work. And I applied the interest-based nervous system model to them with the ICNU stuff we talked about earlier, interest, challenge, novelty, urgency. And my client's like, my job has none of those. It's like, well, I can see why you're not getting anything done, right? And then understanding those sensory needs is also super important. I had one client recently who went from having panic attacks pretty regularly at school to buying some like decibel dimming earbuds, like their earplugs, but they're set at a certain decibel range. So you can still hear the things around you, but everything's turned down, but it's not like muffled. So she started using those at school and is now having no panic attacks. She's like, we had a fire drill and I was fine. And I'm like, that is amazing, right? So how can we shift just these small things that people can do, and it ends up making a huge impact in their mental health. So helping people to understand what their sensory needs are, I think, is really key for addressing some of their issues. And then I think the importance of sensory ND lived experience therapists and supporters is super critical, especially when you're talking about therapy, right? Feeling seen, understood, and validated is really pivotal for successful therapeutic outcomes. And again, like something that was just so missing in my therapeutic experiences as a client. Right. All these communication things were missing. And so of course I didn't feel seen or understood or validated. That double empathy problem can really cause a lot of harm and re-traumatization. So having a shared communication style is really vital in creating that trusting bond. And like I said, with that example of like the 4 different countries, right? Neurotypicals, highly sensitive people, ADHDers, and autistics, right? They're all kind of like neighboring each other. So we do have bridges that we can build. I think me and my husband are a really great example of that. I'm an ADHD or autistic, highly sensitive person type. He's highly sensitive person as well, and he's a high sensation seeking, highly sensitive person. And what does that end up looking like? A lot of novelty, a lot of like wanting adventure and like living outside the box and those sorts of things. So we have really compatible traits, but then we also don't share quite the same deficits. So it's really helpful for us. And I'll just speak for myself. It's really helpful for me and my functioning of just like getting through my day to day, because he's not struggling in the same way and he can pick up the slack and all that. And I can think creatively and outside of the box more than he can. So it's a really good match. So I think having lived experience supporters, they have more of an awareness of clients' needs and experiences, and potentially communication styles. So I think it's really critical. I think part of the success of so many of my clients this year has not necessarily been the model per se that I'm using, but it's really also just because I get it, and that's just so important. I had a recent client say, I've never felt this safe, comfortable, and seen in therapy before. And it's been so healing for so many of my clients just to have that piece. All right, so we're going to go over a little bit in time. This presentation is supposed to be about an hour. It ended up being like an hour and 5 when I presented it last time as well. So just a heads up for that. I want to take a minute on talking about why ABA is harmful. There's so many autistic children who experienced ABA who have grown up and are now adults and are speaking out against this therapy as extremely harmful and traumatizing. I mentioned that autistic people don't do well with reward punishment models, which ABA really relies on. So what's happening is autistic people are basically being traumatized into acting normal. That sounds awful, right? Like some of them even like receive shocks for not doing the right like socializing patterns or skills. It's like that's awful. You're giving people electric shocks. Like I don't even think dogs should be treated like that. So forcing autistic people to act normal is traumatizing because you're really not honoring their own unique social and behavioral differences that are just part of who they are and not something that needs to be changed. So just a warning about ABA. So let's look at some client-reported outcomes. So I've been part of the I Matter program, which provides brief treatment intervention in Colorado, giving youth up to 6 sessions for free. So I've been able to support over 100 sensory NDs this year, ages 10 to 19, and these are the rough outcomes. Um, the vast majority of my clients complete all 6 sessions, right? And this is just roughly estimated. I almost think it's like 100, but I dropped it a little bit just to be conservative. Everybody's reporting positive outcomes. Again, like sometimes I have people drop off. I had one client where like no interventions worked, but they weren't even a sensory ND, so I don't know that I would count that. And so many of them, 70% or more, I'm referring out to long-term therapy. So I am able to find them matches that they feel okay about. And I really work with my clients to get them somebody who's quality and not just like a random person off of Psychology Today. Some fun facts, 90% of my autistic clients who come in who are like, maybe I'm autistic, or I flag them as autistic, they don't seek a formal diagnosis, right? And again, like there's just so much stigma around this. People don't want anything to do with it unless they actually need real accommodations, like for school or for disability. So just in comparison, I said 95% of my clients are completing all 6 sessions. Only 40% of I Matter program clients complete a second session. So that's quite a big difference. And here are some client-reported treatment outcomes. I'm not going to go over all these individually, but just to highlight, I have clients reporting significant reduction in anxiety with no panic attacks since starting therapy. Again, depending on the intervention, like those earplugs, like that could be an easy fix there. Although I do have a lot of clients telling me that in general, the therapy we're doing is reducing their symptoms to at least a manageable place without medication in 6 to 9 sessions. It's amazing. I'm just loving this. So other clients, this client reported being completely out of their depressive episode and getting their grades up and having a mindset change, feeling better in control of themselves. Other clients go from feeling like their anxiety is really intense and problematic, overthinking, paranoia, catastrophizing. They learn the skills that are appropriate for them, and they have such great outcomes of increased self-awareness, self-care, boundaries. Oh my gosh, I'm just so thrilled with how well my clients do in just 6 sessions. And some of them get 9 depending on their needs, which I Matter is cool about. All right, so let's look at some of the conclusions. So I really hope that you see this presentation today as just the start of learning about sensory neurodivergence. Today was really a brief overview of a lot of topics that I could go in way in depth about, and today are just getting snapshots. I really think focusing on solution-focused modalities is the best way to work with sensory neurodivergent populations. I think process-oriented therapy doesn't really work so well, especially when you have neurotypical therapists working with neurodivergent clients. It's just not a match in so many ways. And I think if those therapists instead focused on more solution focused therapies, they could still be effective without having to just refer out all of these clients, which, there's only so many autistic ADHD therapists out there. There's a lot more HSPs. But just keeping those things in mind, that a lot of my clients are like, process oriented does not fly for me. I need real solutions now. We also just need more lived experience supporters. I really feel like my methods work because I get it, and not necessarily because I have so much training with these populations or with the modalities that have traditionally helped them. I'm just doing my own thing based on my own experience, and that's really been critical more so than anything else. And we really need more research and social justice in this area. Sensory neurodivergent people are really misunderstood, and I think we have a lot of work to do in this area, as well as research. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. I really hope that you got a lot out of it, that you were able to connect more dots around these different issues and have a more increased skill set when working with these populations. I do have a couple of upcoming trainings. So this presentation today is actually a much bigger vision of a 6-week training program that I'm putting together. I've got 2 programs now that are launching in the spring, in March and April. I've got one for clinicians, mental health professionals, and students. And then I have another one that's geared towards parents. Now, the trainings are similar, and a lot of the topics that we talked about today are in both trainings. So I really encourage you to email me for more information. You can check out my website. I should have put it on here, but you see that my email is theartofselfhealing.org. You can just go to my website. I now have information about the trainings and sign up and all that details there. So just go to my bookings page and I'll be listing more details on my website soon. So it's a 12-hour program. It's just 2 hours every week. The clinicians program's Friday morning. The parenting is Saturday morning. And like I said, most of the details are on my website right now, and you can always email me for more information. There's a kind of tandem project as well. So there's an opportunity for 6 sessions of consultation or 6 sessions of a processing group for parents. So there's a little bit of a secondary program that you can join if the training went really well and you're looking to actually integrate this with your clients or your family, and you want that hand holding as far as the integration process. That's where that secondary piece can come in. All right, I think that's it for the trainings. I, again, just thank you so much for being here today and listening to everything I had to share. This has really been like my whole career and life in the making. And I appreciate you guys listening and being open to hearing some of this new information. All right, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Oh, if you have any questions, because you're watching this at home, right? You can also just email me. That'd be fine. All right, take care.